really exciting tutorial lined up for you today. We're going to take our simple test scene from looking like this to looking like this. So we're going to be adding larger rocks, fallen trees, ferns, and undergrowth. It's going to be pretty cool. But before we get into that, I wanted to show you one thing that I've done to improve our scene since last week. If you'll remember, last week we added rocks and trees to our scene. And since we worked on it last week, I added some things to blend our trees in a little bit better with our landscape. Let's take a look here. You can see that I've added this landscape material that has roots. We had 5 landscape materials when we built our landscape material, and you can watch that video right here. But we never did use the roots material, which was the last one. And so since last week's video, I went through and for each tree, I painted some roots around the base of the tree to make it look a little bit more integrated with the landscape. I also went around each of the trees and raised up the landscape right around the base so that the landscape kind of rises to meet the tree as if the roots were pulling up the ground a little bit. And both of these techniques serve to make the trees feel like they're that much more connected and they blend in with our landscape a little bit more naturally. That's pretty cool. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started for today's tutorial. This is the process that we're going to follow today. First, we're going to take a look at our reference images and identify the assets that we need to go and hunt down. What we're doing today is adding foliage and undergrowth and larger rocks. So let's take a look at our reference first and figure out what we need to add. Then we're going to go out and find the assets, and we're going to look in Quixel Megascans and a couple of other sources to find these assets. Then we're going to bring the assets into Unreal and bring them into our level and lay them out in what I'm calling a construction yard. And I'll show you more on what I mean by that in a minute. Then we're going to get our assets ready for use by setting up our foliage paint settings, adding collision to the assets that need collision. And then finally, we're going to add each of our individual assets to the scene. And we're going to do this in the order of largest to smallest. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. So let's jump right in and go over our reference images. So here we are in our Pureref program, and what we took a look at a couple of days ago, or in last week's tutorial, is that our scene has trees and rocks, but one of the things that we noticed is that we have various sizes of rocks. So here in this image, you can see that we have small rocks, which is what we've got in our scene now, but we also have larger kind of boulder type rocks. And the scene that we have now doesn't have any of those boulders, so we're going to need to find some of those. Next, we also noticed that there are a lot of fallen logs and tree stumps in the scene. So here's one right here. Let's see, you can also see some over here as well. Here's one that's like extended way out into the stream itself. Here's another fallen tree. So we need to find some of those. And then we also need some undergrowth. So you can see in this image here, we've got some really nice ferns. Over here, we've got some grass and weeds growing. And we also have just some general underbrush. And then finally, our smallest asset that we're going to add is a little bit of grass that's growing right up along the edge of the water. All right, so we need larger rocks, fallen trees, ferns, and then just sort of general undergrowth. So we're going to go ahead and hunt those down in Quixel Megascans. Let's switch over to Bridge app and see what we can find. All right, so here we are in Quixel Bridge, and let's look for some rocks first. So we're going to come over here to our different types of assets and pick 3D assets. Then we're going to pick nature. Then we're going to pick rocks. And now we have to pick what kind of rocks we want. And mossy rocks sounds pretty good. So let's take a look at this category. Now, one of the problems that I'm seeing with some of these assets is that they're kind of flat on the bottom. For example, this one here, I'm going to click on it, and you can see that there's this icon over here that says open. And what that means is that the asset is only intended to be viewed from the top. I'm not able to rotate this asset in any direction in 3D. So I don't want to use this kind because I just want a few assets, maybe 6 rocks total, but then I'm going to randomly rotate them so it looks like I have a lot more. And I can't really do that with this type of an asset because it's only intended to be viewed from the top. It can't be rotated to look at the bottom. So I'm not going to use that one. Let's just kind of keep scrolling down here. So we got lots of assets in the Megascans collection, and there are a lot that might work. So like this one, for example, this one might work. If I switch over to the 3D viewer, we can just kind of tumble it around. You can see that it has this closed icon, which means that we can rotate it in any direction and it'll work. So that one could potentially work. Here's one of the ones that I downloaded. So here's one called Rock Granite. And I think it's the granite collection that I really like. So I'm going to pick this granite category. And I'm just going to download maybe 6 of these or so. This one, and this one, and this one, and this one. So I'm just going to collect a bunch of these granite rocks. And you can see that the scale that I'm looking for is maybe up to the knees or the hips of a person, about that size. And so we'll switch over here to the download settings. And I'm going to download LOD 1, 3, 4, and 5. I don't want LOD 0 because that one's generally too high of a polygon count for what we're looking for. And then I want 2K textures and FBX. So I'll set those download settings, albedo, cavity, normal, and roughness. And then I'll hit the download button. And then once that's done, I'll hit the export button to go ahead and bring it into Unreal. Alright, the next thing that we need to look for are fallen logs and trees. So we'll come up here again, go to 3D Assets, Nature, Tree, and here we have some stumps and debris and fallen. So let's pick fallen here and see what's in this category. Again, there are a lot of assets without bottoms, so we can't really use those. So let's maybe switch back to debris. And this probably is a little bit too small for what we're looking for. Here's log. This one looks okay, but it's not really in the style that we need. We need something with maybe moss on it. I like this one, and I like this one. So we're going to go ahead and download those as well. Alright, and the last thing that we're looking for is the ferns and undergrowth. So let's go to 3D plants. And one thing that you'll find is that there aren't really any trees in this collection, but there are a lot of like little weeds and undergrowth and those kinds of things. There's actually a category for ferns, and I like that. So we're going to go ahead and download this bracken fern set and this fern set here. I really like this one because there are a lot of different variations and varieties of these. And we're going to download all the LODs, albedo, opacity, normal, roughness, and translucency. So we're going to hit download and then hit export to bring them into Unreal. Alright, there is one more type of asset that I want to look for today, and that is a little bit of grass to go right around the edges. And I know that there's a kind of grass in here called swamp grass. Yeah, here it is, swamp grass. So we're going to grab this kind and just kind of put it right around the edges of the water to give ourselves a little bit more interesting detail to look at. So I'm going to download all the LODs except the last one, then albedo, normal, roughness, translucency, and opacity for our swamp grass. So I'll hit download and then export. And now we're ready to jump back over to Unreal and take a look at what we got. Alright, so here we are in Unreal again, and you can see in our Megascans folder here, I've gone ahead and downloaded a whole bunch of different 3D assets, a lot of different kinds of rocks, Here's a log, another log. I've gotten all these assets, and what I want to do is take a look at what I've got and just make sure that it's going to work together in the scene. And so I created what I like to call a construction yard. So let's find that in my map here. Here we go. So I'm just going to come over here and take a look. And so this is my construction yard, and what I've done is just kind of laid everything out so that I can see what I have and if the assets that I have are at the quality level that I want, and if the assets are working together as a group. And so that's what I'm going to do now. So here you can see I've got these logs. And for each of these assets, don't worry about identifying them visually. I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the description to where you can get these so you'll know exactly which Megascans assets I downloaded. So here are the logs that I grabbed. So not only am I using logs from Megascans, but I also found some assets under KiteDemo. Now this can be downloaded from the Unreal Store or the Marketplace. If you look under Open World Demo. In Unreal it's called the KiteDemo, but in the Marketplace you find it under Open World Demo. I'm going to come down here under Foliage, and you can see that I'm using the Bog Myrtle here from the KiteDemo. These 3 different Bog Myrtle plants, and I'm also using these 3 Ferns from the KiteDemo as well. And then for these logs over here, if I come under trees, you can see that I have the tree stump, and I also have this vegetation debris item here that I'm also using for a fallen log. So I'm using those assets from the KiteDemo, and I'm using these assets from the KiteDemo, and then these rocks here I'm using from Megascans, and then here are all the ferns that I found from Megascans as well. So let's go and take a look at those. If I take a look at Megascans 3D plants, I've got the bracken fern, the fern, and I also have the swamp grass. Now I didn't lay that out in my construction yard here, but I am going to use it just a little bit later. Okay, so we've got everything laid out. The next thing that we need to do is set things up so we're ready to add them to the scene. Now these rocks, when I download them from Megascans, they actually don't have any collision. And these are large enough. Here, let's switch over to our game view. So if I run around with my player, you can see that these rocks are large enough that I'm going to need to run into them with my character. It would be really weird if my character just ran right through these rocks. These rocks down here in the stream bed, I made them small enough so that so that you don't actually collide with them. But the larger ones that I'm about to add, I do want collision. And so I can go ahead and do that using the tools inside Unreal itself. So let's do that. So I'm going to come over here to the static mesh for my asset and double click it. And it's going to bring the asset up in its own window here. And if I want to add collision, I can come up here under the collision menu and choose auto convex collision. And the nice thing about this tool that I'm about to show you is that it calculates a really efficient collision with as few triangles as possible. So here are the settings down here, convex decomposition. And if I hit apply, it's going to go ahead and generate collision for me. Now, I don't know if you can see it, but there's like this subtle green wireframe here. We're going to go into the rock, you can see it. But what it's done is it's created this collision hull for me that is as efficient as possible. It's like using very few triangles, and it'll allow my player to collide with this rock, but not use too many collision triangles. I really like using this tool. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for all of my rocks. And so now all of my rocks have collision, and you can see if I switch over here to play mode that my character runs into them or jumps up on top of them instead of passing right through. And that's an important step that you have to do for Megascans assets. Let's go ahead and do that for our tree trunks as well. So I'm just going to pick each tree trunk and open it in the viewer. Come up to collision, go to auto convex collision, and hit apply. I usually don't need to mess with any of the settings here, and then we'll save each of these assets. So I did it for that trunk. I'll do it for this one. Hit save. Just gonna go ahead and add collision to each of these. And the other neat thing is I'll be able to run on top of these logs, so I may be able to use them as a little bridge across the stream if I choose to put them there. Alright, let's test these out. So I'll take my mannequin character over here and I can run right into the log. I can jump up on top of it. Great. So I've got the collision that I need. The other thing that I need to do is take the assets that I'm going to use the foliage tool on, and I need to set these up so that I can do foliage scattering. So let's come over here to our modes. I'm going to come into our foliage mode, and that'll bring up this menu. Now I've already added these, but what you'll need to do is for all the assets that you're going to paint as foliage, you'll need to add them to this menu here. So you can see I've got the bracken from the KiteDemo. I've got my rocks here from Megascans. I've got my ferns from Megascans, and here I have my swamp grass from Megascans as well. And then down here you can see the rocks that we already used for our stream bed. So let's go over the settings that I used for these. First of all, let's set up these rocks here. These are the rocks that I'm going to add, the ones that I just added collision to. And so I'm going to minimize my content browser and then bring up these properties just so you can see better what's going on. So for the rocks, I want a density of 1. And in fact, this density doesn't matter because I'm going to use a different tool for applying the rocks. Instead of using the paint tool, I'm going to use the single tool. Let me show you what that does. So here's the paint tool. And if I come over here to my rocks and I click the checkbox, now these are the assets that I'm going to be painting on the terrain. So if I click and drag, it'll add a bunch of rocks. But that's not how I want to do it with these rocks. I just want to use this single tool so that I can place them exactly where I want them to go. So I'm going to pick single. And now I can just do single clicks. And with each click, it's going to place down a rock. That's pretty cool. That's what I'm looking for. I want to be able to precisely put these rocks where I want them. Because they have collision on them, they're going to affect gameplay. So I want to be able to very carefully control where they go. So again, the density doesn't really matter. The scaling I'm going to set between 1 and 2. The ground slope angle, what this means is it's not going to put any rocks on angles where the landscape is steeper than 45 degrees. I do want random yaw because that's going to rotate the rocks around the yaw axis randomly. And random pitch angle is rotating around the pitch axis randomly too. So these settings here are what's going to rotate the rocks on the X and Y and Z axes so that I get all kinds of random rotation for the rocks. Now the cull distance, I've set each of my rocks to be a different cull distance that's right around 10,000 centimeters or 100 meters. And this distance is larger than my other smaller rocks because these rocks are bigger and I want them to fade out further away. And also, unlike my other set of rocks, I'm casting shadows with these. And I think that's pretty much it. So I'm going to go ahead and apply these rocks to my scene. And like I said, these rocks, because they have collision, they do affect gameplay. So I need to be kind of thoughtful and careful about where I place them down. So I'm going to go ahead and just start adding these rocks to my scene and just kind of place them around a rock here and a rock over here. Now, one thing that's important is the player needs to know when they look at a rock, am I going to collide with this or not? They need to be able to know without looking whether they're going to collide with the rock. So you'll notice that these larger rocks, there's a really nice contrast in size between the ones that you collide with and the ones that you don't. I've kept the smaller rocks with no collision small, and these rocks are a bit bigger, so you can tell just by looking, oh, I'm going to collide with that rock versus the ones that you don't. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and paint these rocks around my scene, and I'll be right back and show you what I did. Alright, I'm just about done placing down my large rocks. And there is one interesting thing about this single placement tool that I wanted to mention. If I come up here under single and I drop this menu down, there is this option to put all selected items down. And if this is true, and I have a bunch of different rocks checked here, and I click, it's basically going to add every single rock that I have selected all in one place. And that's definitely not what I want. So if I have a bunch of different assets and I want to, each time I click, add a different one kind of in a random order, I'm going to uncheck all selected and check cycles through selected, so that each time I click it's going to put down a different random one. Okay, so you can see that I've got my rocks placed around my stream bed here, and let's go ahead and switch back to select mode and hit play and kind of run through our environment and take a look at what I've done. So you can see that I've got these large boulders here. My character can kind of run up and around the large boulders, and it adds some really nice variety. I have a nice contrast between my small river rocks and the larger boulders in the stream, and it adds some nice variety to what I'm seeing. Alright, the next thing that I want to do is add the tree trunks, and I don't want to randomly rotate these, so I'm not going to use the foliage placement tool. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste these and place them around my scene manually. And this is going to take a little while, and I want to kind of be thoughtful with where I put these. And so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of place these assets around my scene kind of like this. And I want to rotate them manually because I need to line them up so that it looks like they've kind of been placed by gravity. I need to have some really tight control over the way these assets are rotated. So I'm going to be really careful with these and just place them myself instead of just kind of randomly scattering them around. I might even want to sort of tell a story with these. So for example, this tree is lying here, and I might want to try to put a stump right up here where it might have come from. So now you can see, maybe I used to have a tree growing in this spot and it fell down, and now you can see the remains of it here have fallen into my stream. So it's important as you're placing assets to think of the history of these things and how they might have come to rest in these specific locations, and try to place assets in sort of natural locations and tell a history of where they came from. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and place these trunks all around and come back and show you what I did. Okay, I'm just about done putting down our fallen logs and tree stumps and such. And there are just a couple of things that I wanted to show you. First of all, I can duplicate an asset if I hold down Alt and click and drag. That will copy it without having to copy and paste. That was something that I learned from one of the comments from the last video. So I really appreciate you guys commenting down below and giving me tips and things that I've missed. So if I hold down Alt, I can click and drag and make a copy. The other thing that's nice to know is that I can switch back and forth between world space and local space for manipulating an object. So for example, right now I'm in world space, which means I can move it in, I can move my log in world Z, world X, and world Y. But if I hold down Control and hit the tilde key, now I'm in object space, which means I can slide the log like this. And that's especially useful for rotation. So if I switch to rotation mode, now I can rotate my log around its own local axis. And that's really helpful for positioning things. So sometimes you want to move objects in world space like this, and sometimes you want to move it in local space like this. There's also a button up here which will allow you to do the same thing. So you can cycle from world to local and back. So there are a couple of stories that I've told with my assets. As I said, I wanted to make things feel a little bit natural. And you can see here, I used to have a tree growing here at this stump, but that tree has fallen, and there's a log here, and then this asset here that I'm using kind of as the tip of the tree. And the tree is broken in the stream, and parts of it have been carried away. So I'm just kind of telling some stories with the way that I'm laying out these assets. Instead of just completely randomly laying them out, I'm laying them out in a way that makes sense. I also went ahead and went over to Bridge and downloaded a couple of more stump assets so that I could get some unique looks for fallen trees. And I'll go ahead and put the links to those assets in the description so you guys can know which ones I used. So let's just take a look here. Let's run through our level with our mannequin and take a look. You can see I've got my fallen tree here. And as I run, you can see that I've placed logs and wood debris around the scene just to kind of spice things up and make it look a little bit more interesting, kind of more natural, showing the natural progression of the forest from saplings all the way through regular trees to dead logs. All right, the next thing that we need to do in our scene is arrange our undergrowth. And so we'll come over here to our construction yard, and you can see that I have my ferns and my other items for undergrowth. And we're going to go ahead and switch over to our foliage mode for this. And I want to show you how I have it set up. So we're going to add these bog myrtle bushes. And we're also going to add all of these ferns. Okay, so for my density, you can see I've got multiple values here, and most of these are set to a density of 0.3. This is a really low density, and the reason the density is low is because I've got so many assets selected at the same time that I'm going to paint. Let's just set our brush size to about 100. I'm going to come up here in this open area and just show you what this looks like as I paint these assets. So I can just swipe my brush back and forth on my landscape here, and you can see that I've got some nice ferns. They're kind of laid down randomly, and because I'm using ferns from both the open world KiteDemo and also from Megascans, you can see that I have a little bit of variety in color, and that kind of makes things more interesting. Now I feel like my density is a little bit thin here, so I'm going to go ahead and undo that and maybe increase this density to 0.5. And what this means is it's going to put down 0.5 of an asset every 10 meters. But because I have so many assets selected, that's going to add up to quite a bit. Let's see what this new density looks like. I'll just kind of swipe across my terrain here. And yeah, that maybe looks like a pretty good density value. I want to strike a really careful balance between really lush looking foliage and not too dense that it's going to kill my performance. So I want to be kind of careful with that. You can see I've set my scale to 0.5 and a maximum of 1.2. So I get a nice variety of sizes of plants here. I also am using align to normal, which means my plants are going to line up with the terrain. So if I come over here and I paint on the sides of cliffs, I'll be able to get some plants that kind of hang off the sides of the cliffs, and they'll align to the direction that the landscape is facing there. But you can see that I've limited that angle to a maximum of 20. So if my cliff is steeper than 20 degrees, the plant is going to angle itself a little bit to try to line up with a cliff, but it's not going to it's not going to grow sideways. In other words, it's still going to try to point itself upward to reach the sun, but it's going to align itself up to 20 degrees with the slope. I've got a little bit of random pitch angle in here. If this is 0, all my plants are going to grow perfectly straight up. And so I've set this value here to 10 to kind of randomize the direction that my plants are facing, make them feel a little bit more chaotic, a little bit more natural. All right, and then I've got my ground slope angle set to about 80. It says max multiple values here, but most of these plants are set to 80, which means they'll grow along fairly steep slopes. I've also got my cull distance set to multiple values, and that's working just like the rocks that we laid down last week. Now this is interesting because depending on the size of the assets, they're going to be culling out at various distances. So the small rocks will cull out first, then the ferns will cull out, and then the larger rocks will cull out. So, and each of these individual ferns has a different culling distance so that it doesn't happen all at once in a single line. The other couple of settings that I wanted to point out are I've got cast shadows on, and that is going to be kind of expensive, but because of the size of these assets, they do need to cast shadows. And then finally, and probably most important, I have enable density scaling turned on as well, so that these assets can scale their density with the graphics quality setting that the user or the player selects. And that's important because when assets are too dense, it can really hurt performance. So if that happens, I want the player to be able to set their quality setting a little bit lower and kind of thin out this dense foliage. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and come along the banks here, everywhere where I have moss growing, and I'm going to go ahead and paint this foliage and just kind of fill in these mossy areas. And this is another thing that I want to point out. Did you notice that I put down assets from largest to smallest? And the reason that I did that is it avoids me having assets inside other assets. For example, if I had put down this rock after I had put down all these ferns, it might be covering up some of the ferns, and either that would be really inefficient, or I would have to come back in with the eraser tool here and get rid of the ones that were inside. So if you put down assets from largest to smallest, it saves you some work and makes things a little bit more efficient because you don't end up with assets inside other assets. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and go and paint all of my ferns and undergrowth down here, and then I'll come back and show you what I've done. Okay, I'm just about done adding my ferns. I've just kind of gone along the bank and added ferns everywhere where I had moss material in the landscape. So this is a pretty simple process. Once I had all my foliage painting settings set, I can just kind of go along and paint ferns wherever I had the moss landscape material. And you can see that it sure added a lot to my scene. That's pretty incredible. Let's take it for a spin with our mannequin and see what our scene looks like now that we've got all kinds of fern assets in here. Man, that just really brought things to life. We have all kinds of animated ferns, and if you look way off in the distance, I don't know if you can see this here, but my large rocks pop out, and then my ferns pop out, and then my small rocks pop out. So they're all culling out at various distances. This is important both for performance and to kind of hide the fact that they're culling out. So one of the things that I found with the Megascans assets is that the translucency on the ferns was really, really bright by default. And so I went ahead and opened up the instance of the material, and by default I think this color tint value was white and this color intensity was 1. So, and that translucency was just way too bright, and it made the ferns look like they were glowing. So I went ahead and set that translucency value to a much more natural looking green, and I also set the intensity of the translucency down quite a bit, so that the ferns wouldn't look as much like they were just absolutely glowing. Okay, there is one last touch that I want to add to my environment, and that is I want to add in that swamp grass that we downloaded. I want a little bit of grass growing right along here, right at the edges of the water. And so for the swamp grass, we're going to switch back to our foliage paint mode. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off all of these assets that I was painting previously. Okay, so these are my swamp grass assets. And you can see I've got all of them selected. So I'm going to go ahead and tweak the foliage paint settings. For density, I set this to 200. And that's potentially pretty dangerous because you can see if I just start going crazy, I can get swamp grass everywhere. So what I'm going to do when I paint my swamp grass is I'm going to set my brush size down fairly small. Maybe let's try 30, like a 30 centimeter brush radius, just so I can paint and get the swamp grass like exactly where I want it to go. And I'm just going to kind of fit it in here and there around the edges of the water just to add some variety to the vegetation. So I've set my density to 200, but in order to control that, like I said, I'm going to keep my brush fairly small. And then I've set my scale from 0.5 to 1.2 to give myself some size variety. I've set my slope angle to 45 degrees so that the swamp grass won't grow on slopes. I also turned off align to normal, so the grass is going to always grow straight up. And I set my random yaw to 10 degrees, so the grass is going to not be always pointed straight up, but plus or minus 10 degrees off from straight up. And then obviously I've got my shadows turned off and enable density scaling turned on, so that the density of the swamp grass can be reduced if the players choose to set their graphics settings lower. So I'm just going to kind of come along here along the bank and paint in some swamp grass. One other thing, for the cull distance on the swamp grass, we've got multiple values here, and each of my swamp grass elements is set between 4,500 and 5,500, so that as I back out, the swamp grass will cull out. And it's actually the first thing that culls out even before the rocks, and that's because at this distance it's pretty much alpha testing itself away anyway, so it helps the performance to go ahead and cull it at that distance. Okay, so I'm just going to come along the bank here and add my swamp grass growing in here on the edges, and then I'll come back and show you what I did. Okay, so I've gone all around the bank of my little stream here, and I've added this swamp grass in the cracks between all the little rocks, and I really like what this is doing for my scene. You can see that it just adds like an extra layer of lushness in here. So let's switch back to our select mode and grab our mannequin and go for a run like we always do. You can see that now I've got this swamp grass here right along the edges, and then a nice layer of ferns and other undergrowth, and the scene is just really coming to life. And because I put in things from large to small, I was able to fit my swamp grass in here just around the edges of all of the other rocks, which is really nice. So we're making some great progress on our scene here. I'm really excited where this is going. And at this point, the scene is practically begging to have some water in it. This dry riverbed just looks kind of crazy with all this lush green growing in and around it. So I think next week what we'll do is get started on creating a river water shader. and that's going to be pretty cool as well. So I hope you come back for that. If you guys have ideas for other things that we can fit into our scene, I'd be happy to consider some of your suggestions. Maybe put those down in the comments. What else can we put in our scene, or how can we improve this to make it look even cooler? All right, come back next week for the stream water shader tutorial, and until then, I'll see you later.